Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the American Center in Moscow. I'm pleased to introduce Mark Resnick, the author of Blazing a Trail, Dorothy Waugh's National Parks posters, and curator of its current exhibit at Poster House in New York City. Mark is an authority on the history of American graphic design, a field in which he curates, publishes, and lectures. He has also served as an art museum director, as chief business and legal executive at major film companies, and on various arts-related boards. He is the founder of Resnick Arts and Culture Consulting, which advises cultural institutions and their leaders on a wide range of matters and counsels major collectors on the sale or donations of their collections. So I will turn it over to you, Mark.
Thanks so much, Grace. I appreciate that introduction. And thank you to all of you who are joining this talk online. I'm in Los Angeles, and I appreciate that you've taken the time with the time difference to attend. I want to say that this talk originated in conjunction with that exhibition that Grace mentioned, which I recently curated at Poster House Museum in New York City. And as Grace noted, it was accompanied by a book that I wrote, and both are entitled Blazing a Trail, Dorothy Waugh's National Parks Posters. Here you see Dorothy herself as a young woman overlooking her beloved Connecticut River Valley, which is in the northwestern United States. If you'd like to know more details, excuse me, about the exhibition and the book, which have helped restore Waugh's place as a pioneer of modernist American graphic design, you can visit Poster House's website, which is posterhouse.org. The 17 posters that Waugh designed to promote the national parks in the mid-1930s comprise a striking visual record in the history of the Great Depression, which was the worst financial catastrophe in United States history. And they are also a turning point in American graphic design. Next, please. Here's a glimpse of just a few of the posters from Waugh's promotional campaign. And don't worry at all about picking out individual posters here, because we will give considerable time to the entire campaign in the middle of this talk. And I say in the middle of this talk because this evening we'll also situate the campaign within Waugh's remarkable 100-year life. Next. A life that included the 10 diverse and successful careers noted in this list, which I'll give you a moment to read. Although a broad look at Waugh's life was beyond the scope of the exhibition and the book, using a wide-angle lens here will, I think, be useful in a few different ways. It will help us to more fully contextualize the campaign, to reveal abilities and traits that allowed Waugh, decade after decade, to break through multiple so-called glass ceilings. And it will raise the question of whether, which is somewhat counterintuitive, whether Waugh's polymathy factored into her slide into obscurity. Next. Waugh was born in the state of Vermont in 1896 to parents Frank and Alice Waugh. She was the second of ultimately 6 Waugh children. In 1902, the growing family moved to Amherst, Massachusetts, because Frank, her father, who was at the forefront of the field of landscape architecture, was hired to establish one of the nation's first landscape architecture programs. He did that at what is now the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Both Father Frank and Mother Alice had been highly educated in the Midwest in the early 1890s. Extraordinarily, they would ensure that all 6 of their kids received at least a college degree, and for several, an advanced degree. Next. Here we see the entire Waugh family. Young Dorothy appears just to the right of her 2 older brothers. The Waugh children had an idyllic childhood, immersed in nature and in a welcoming academic community. Waugh would later write, quote, "This wonderful environment became the playground of 6 Waugh children, who also happily assisted in the college's orchards, vineyards, prize herds, arboretums, sheepcotes, and helped with the animal incubators, maple sugar making, and operating the snowplow." The children were also regularly allowed to sit in on college classes, Dorothy notably on many landscape architecture classes. Dinner guests were likely to include luminaries from many fields, poets such as Robert Frost, accomplished musicians and visual artists, and landscape architects from Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. to those from Europe and Japan with whom Frank had collaborated and visited. Summers were spent almost entirely outdoors at Lake Champlain. Next. Frank, shown here, had an enormous influence on Dorothy. For starters, he too was a polymath. He was an accomplished printmaker, photographer, and musician. And he found time for those pursuits on top of his landscape architecture teaching, his work for the U.S. Forest Service, his planning of towns and campuses, and his prolific academic and popular writing. Not surprisingly, Frank took a highly interdisciplinary approach to teaching his students, an approach that was also evident in frequent field trips with his young children. Frank assigned them projects based on their observation of nature, including musical performances, specimen drawings, poems, and essays. Next. Here we see Dorothy painting directly from nature, observed by her younger brother, Sidney. Let me simply say about Sidney that recounting his fascinating life and artistic accomplishments would require its entire own lecture, as perhaps would be the case for her other siblings. Next. When Dorothy reached age 15, her parents enrolled her at the George School, an excellent preparatory high school in Bucks County, Pennsylvania, from which she returned home on weekends. Amidst a host of other activities, Dorothy served as editor-in-chief of the school's newspaper and a member of its debate team, further developing the verbal traits that she refers to in this quote. After graduating in 1915, Dorothy moved to Boston for a year, though she still returned home on weekends. In Boston, she studied at the Massachusetts College of Art and worked part-time at a landscape architecture firm. With these formative experiences under her belt, all of which would prove indispensable in the National Park Service campaign and beyond, it was now time to really leave home. And we'll refer to the National Park Service by its abbreviation, NPS. Next. As Dorothy would later humorously put it, quote, "In 1916, my father sent me to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago," which we see here, to make me more independent. It worked too well. I might add here that that art school was and is one of the nation's finest. Next. Next. It was a great plan, but then, with Dorothy having completed only her first year at the Art Institute, the United States, under President Woodrow Wilson, entered into World War I. So in 1917, it was back home to Amherst, Massachusetts, where she completed another year of landscape architecture courses in her father's program. Yet by 1918, Dorothy, restless, departed. She was now 21 years old. Next. For the next decade, Dorothy undertook an odyssey across 2 continents. By day, she worked as a landscape architect, and in the evening, she continued her art education at well-regarded schools. The journey took her from New England to the mid-Atlantic, to the Southeast, to the Midwest, to several countries in Europe, to New England again, to the South again, and finally to the Midwest again, specifically Chicago. And so she had come full circle. Next. Now considerably older and more worldly than her classmates, she re-enrolled in the Art Institute, from which she graduated in 1928 with honors. At the Institute, she was exposed to the European avant-garde art and design movements that were then gaining traction in the United States. But she also began to develop her own distinctive brand of American modernism, in which she freely mixed those movements without regard to purity or dogma, while embracing American commercial illustration, subject matter, popular culture, and iconography. Next. On a map, Waugh's arduous working journey looks like this. And I think it says a lot about her capacities, including the ability to undertake multiple pursuits simultaneously. And it says a lot about her spirit. From the outset, circumstances were rough. World War I still raged. The Spanish flu pandemic had broken out, and it would extend well beyond the war. Despite the roaring 1920s moniker we've all heard, the economy was actually boom and bust, and it was marked by frequent recessions. And her journey contravened all of the era's mores, because Waugh was an itinerant young woman, almost always traveled alone, and was working in a field, landscape architecture, that was dominated by men, whom she often supervised. A quote from Waugh is to the point. Quote, "A chief objection was that it would be difficult for a woman, but in actual practice, I have found that seldom proves to be a real objection when a case is put to the test." Next. Excuse me, just a little water here. After graduation from the Art Institute, Waugh landed coveted freelance work for Chicago book, magazine, and newspaper publishers and advertising agencies. She gained experience in all aspects of production, layout and design, finished artwork and lettering, covers, end papers, and bindings, as well as in marketing-driven copywriting. Next. On the side, she wrote, illustrated, and designed this very well-received book for youngsters entitled Amongst the Leaves and Grasses. It featured 7 common insects and was published by New York's Henry Holt and Company in 1931. It was the first of numerous publications to showcase Waugh's grasp of science and her talent for making scholarship readily understood and enjoyable to read and see. The book's beautiful modernist illustrations and inventive lettering anticipated the language of the national park's posters, and its success spurred Waugh's move to New York City. There, for the next 2 years, she would further the work she had done in Chicago, but this time for many of the nation's most prominent book publishers. And she would also serve as art director for one of them. Next. But in 1933, with the country in the depths of the Great Depression, Waugh's publishing work all but vanished. In a letter to her parents that spring, Sidney said of his sister, quote, "I do not quite see how Dorothy keeps up her courage. New York is still at the very bottom, and there are no prospects of recovery." Next. However, that summer, Waugh was contacted by this man, Conrad Worth, who was an assistant director of the National Park Service. He had a major project for her, which would prove to be the first of many. Next. A little known today is that the national parks were a centerpiece of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal to get the nation out of the Depression. Roosevelt held the strong conviction that parks conservation and tourism were key in restoring the country's shattered morale and economy. But they were in need of restoration themselves. You've probably heard the phrase by many historians that the national parks are America's best idea, and they have been emulated worldwide. But back to our story. At lightning speed, Roosevelt needed to establish what he called the Civilian Conservation Corps, which would go on to employ 3 million young men in manual labor on public lands. Many of them would work under Worth in the effort to construct the very broad range of parks buildings that would be required for any boom in tourism. But there was a big problem. The CCC boys, as they were called, couldn't read blueprints, and they had low literacy rates. Next. Crucially, Waugh rapidly gathered blueprints of exemplary structures from across the nation and translated them into detailed, yet easy to follow, illustrational construction drawings, supplemented with very basic text. The resulting loose-leaf portfolio of park structures and facilities was rushed straight to the field in installments, and it kept the boys working. Shown here is a rare surviving copy of the portfolio, along with one of Waugh's hundreds of drawings. Propelled by the portfolio's success, Waugh became responsible for the design and production of all National Park Service materials that required sophisticated graphics. And she was one of only 2 women in prominent positions in the agency. Next. Now, Worth, who would go on to head the entire National Park Service, had long known of Waugh's many abilities. He had been her father's star pupil, was embraced by the Waugh family, and had employed Dorothy for a time during her odyssey. And Waugh, well, almost from the outset of her NPS employment, she had advocated that the agency produce its own poster campaign, separate from the campaigns of the railroad companies that, by default, the NPS had long relied on. She wanted a campaign that would have its own bold new style and messages that reflected the administration's aims, not those of a commercial enterprise like the railroads. This was all in an era when posters were still preeminent for ambitious promotion. Their scale and striking visuals commanded attention even at some distance. When federal funding for such a campaign finally became available in 1934, Worth ensured that Waugh was entrusted with its design. It marked the first time the government had assigned such an ambitious project to a solo designer, let alone a female modernist working within a male-dominated bureaucracy. For the next 3 years, her 17 posters, at once avant-garde and accessible, would be distributed nationwide and in some instances abroad. They would be displayed in bus and railroad stations, travel agencies, sporting goods and department stores, post offices, schools, and other public or government sites. And they would contribute to a 250% increase in national parks visitors. They would also set the stage for a deluge of government-issued posters that would continue through much of the 20th century. Next. I'm going to be quiet for a moment while you look at and compare some typical railroad company posters on the left with one of Waugh's posters on the right. Waugh's posters would have looked remarkably new and modern to the public, with, as we will see, her style ranging from children's book illustrational to cutting-edge modernist, and with each design having its own, often innovative lettering. Whereas the railroad company posters, while attractive enough, followed a specific formula tied to the company's mission of increasing passenger numbers, which were declining rapidly due to the economy and competition from the automobile. We see hallmarks of the railroad company formula here. The images in the company's posters typically show a specific park served by the railroad, the rugged route to that park, or the train itself, to emphasize the railroad's ability to deliver a visitor over long distances right to their chosen park's doorstep, reliably, safely, and comfortably. Those images were reproductions of dramatic, highly realistic paintings, existing or commissioned by a third-party painter. A corporate logo identified which railroad company, and the text simply indicated the specific destination or train. But in Waugh's poster at the right, the landscape is more abstract. No single or identifiable park is shown. Also, Waugh designs the poster in its entirety. No one else's painting or work is imported. Her choice of yellow for the water and sky and a framing device of staggered heavy black bars is avant-garde. Her text is rather poetic. The adventure she touts up there in the top is essentially solitude, found in the contemplative act of fishing. The poster likewise subtly conveys some of the campaign's broader themes, namely the parks as a unified whole, a system that is strategically stewarded by the NPS on behalf of the park's true owners, all Americans, and the theme of the regenerative spirit of the parks. Hence Waugh's consistently upbeat depictions, so different than the era's gritty social realist art. Next. Working alone, Waugh delivered the posters in the series you see listed here. To create each poster, she made a watercolor composition on a paper board that was the same size as the final poster, 40 by 27 inches. And then she oversaw the translation of that image into a lithographic print. We should keep in mind that because she was allowed only one paper board per poster, she had to execute her concept exactly right on the first attempt. That's how tight money was at that moment. Now, let's look at the different series, but in the interest of time, just one or two posters from each series. Next. In recent years, the number of national parks had increased considerably, and the additions were strategically located in states that had not had any parks. The NPS wanted to raise public awareness of this dramatic systemic growth. And so for this first series, Waugh delivered the posters in what she called spring and winter batches. In the spring poster at left, Waugh highlights the park's magnetic pull, their lure, by borrowing from the appeal of the movies, which had remained enormously popular despite the Depression. The horizontal, tightly cropped image of men on horseback crossing a river suggests a movie screen moment from a Western, that quintessentially American film genre. The winter poster at right reflects the agency's recognition that parks tourism had to be year-round to make the greatest economic impact, including in the colder months when travel was far less popular. Here we have an emphasis on the exciting winter sports now on offer at your parks, especially alpine or downhill skiing, newly popular in the United States, thanks in many cases to ski trails cut by the CCC boys. The poster is unlike any previously created by an American designer. It fuses elements associated with the European avant-garde, such as geometric forms, flat primary colors, and sans serif lettering, with Waugh's own unique visual language, and the black banners of text cleverly double as a ski racing gate. Next. Although the national parks had indeed grown in number, they were still remote for so many Americans, and their growth still lagged the population's ever-increasing demand for diversion from the Depression's grim realities. Yet it was extremely difficult to create more national parks because by law, each had to represent a natural setting that was unique in the country. The state parks, on the other hand, only had to have local or regional significance. So President Roosevelt, keen to stimulate local economies, was happy to foster the era's explosive growth of state parks. The administration did so by donating the advice of the NPS and coordination with the agency, but also by donating the Civilian Conservation Corps' labor. The state park satisfied yet another priority of the New Dealers, who believed and who made it policy that free, easily reached, year-round outdoor recreation was vital for the nation's morale and health, and could keep the unemployed out of mischief. Through the burgeoning state parks, the New Dealers implemented the most extensive recreation program in United States history. Highlighting this initiative, Waugh's poster depicts stunning state park scenery, with text at the bottom that serves to inventory the park's recreational opportunities. It's an American scene, but the palette bursts with vibrant, contrasting colors reminiscent of Europe's fauvists. Next. The Roosevelt administration also believed that Americans' shared history and traditions could unite the nation, especially in times of hardship, around what the administration called a usable past. They also believed that knowing the country's history was a mark of good citizenship. The New Dealers considered the parks and the numerous national monuments to be repositories of that history. Now, the monuments were especially susceptible to presidential action because, unlike the requirement that Congress designate a national park, a president could unilaterally establish a national monument by citing its significance in archaeological, natural, or national history. In many instances, Roosevelt did exactly that, and he rapidly consolidated under the NPS what had been spotty multi-agency oversight of the monuments. This series spoke to the NPS's new role and aimed to drive visits to specific monuments, many of which had been woefully underpromoted. And this is why, for the first time in the campaign, Waugh depicts specific locales. Here, she shows Colorado's Mesa Verde, which is today a UNESCO World Heritage Site, with its magnificent stone structures made by the ancestral Puebloans between 550 and 1300 AD. It's already a compelling subject, and Waugh further enlivens it with an earthy southwestern palette, distinctive lettering, and a purple sky. Next. The Depression-era ecological catastrophe, known as the Dust Bowl, spurred the government's protection of the environment and wildlife by establishing or reinforcing various agencies and staffing them with scientists and by creating wildlife refuges. In this final series, Waugh, for a joint campaign by the NPS and the Department of Agriculture, she was to design posters featuring 5 endangered animals. Starting with this well-received poster of a trumpeter swan, whose threatened extinction was indeed ultimately averted largely through federal efforts. The next poster was of a bighorn sheep. NPS scientists enthusiastically approved its design, and at great expense, 5,000 copies were printed. But the Department of Agriculture considered the poster's modernism too unrealistic and disliked its stylized lettering. So the NPS reluctantly destroyed every single copy of the sheep poster before any distribution could occur and abandoned the remainder of the series. That is why we cannot show you a copy of that poster here. All of this is quite ironic to me, because had straight realism been Waugh's directive, no problem. As we'll see, she was a master of scientific illustration. Next. Waugh's campaign would have a lasting impact. Several government agencies quickly followed in the NPS's footsteps, undertaking campaigns of their own. For example, what we see here, the Federal Art Project, or the FAP, the Rural Electrification Administration, or the REA, and the World War II Office of War Information, or OWI. The floodgates had opened, and thereafter, officials across the government would use the succinct and visually powerful medium of the poster to convey all manner of messages. Aided by the rapid growth of the graphic design profession, it was a deluge that would continue for much of the 20th century, and it would contribute to the government's ever-increasing presence in American visual culture. Next. In 1937, Waugh left the NPS to work for the renowned publishing house Alfred A. Knopf in New York City, whose logo you see here with its distinctive leaping borzoi. Next. Husband and wife founders Alfred and Blanche Knopf, at left, personally recruited Waugh, charging her to head a new department for the firm called Books for Young People. From its inception, Knopf had been known for its literary taste, its internationalism, and the physical beauty of its books. Blanche and Dorothy believed those attributes could apply equally to books for adolescents, whose reading habits could be shaped early on, including a taste for books that were neither formulaic, simplistic, nor condescending. Waugh's leadership of the department was a success, contributing to the publishing house's prestige and sales through books that won many awards, including repeatedly the American Institute of Graphic Arts contest for the 50 best designed books of the year. Waugh was hands-on with the books, from pitch to marketing and distribution. The books were by major talents who, eager to collaborate with Waugh, agreed to work for the first time in the youth category. Waugh, once again ahead of the curve, proved a forerunner. After World War II, there would be an explosion in the young adult fiction publishing. Next. Bear with me a moment here. Okay. Waugh's work for Knopf was exciting, but all-consuming. In 1940, she left the firm to find employment that, while stimulating, would allow her to pursue her many talents and interests. A position as head of public relations at the Montclair Public Library in New Jersey proved to be perfect. It was a highly regarded, modern and beautiful regional library. It had also been selected by International Business Machines, which we know as IBM, to establish the nation's first ever computerized book circulation and acquisition program. New York's Museum of Modern Art, recognizing the Montclair Library's numerous innovative practices, distributed a film about it internationally entitled Portrait of a Library in Action, which prompted visits from librarians worldwide. For the next 25 years, Waugh, commuting from her apartment in Manhattan, would have sole or shared responsibility for all such initiatives. And she would continue to write influential articles for the library field at large. Impressed, Montclair's mayor retained her to also head public relations for the municipality. With Montclair as a home base, Waugh's varied output multiplied and evolved. Let's take a quick look. In the early 1940s, Waugh served as a pioneering design educator at two top art and design schools. At Parsons, she organized and taught the school's first ever course dedicated to lettering and typography. And at Cooper Union, she taught advanced advertising design for wartime service. Next. Okay, sorry about that. Give me a moment here. Okay, next, please. Next, please. Yeah. In the early 1940s, she resumed work on books that she wrote, illustrated, and designed in their entirety, with one of those published every few years. These, what I call auteur books, plus the collaborations, which she also resumed, amounted to some 50 books for just about every major publishing house. Warm Earth, the auteur example shown here, was published by Oxford University Press. A sophisticated book for young adults, it explained the magic that happens beneath the soil, allowing plants to grow and flourish. The New York Press lauded the book's accurate but approachable narrative and deft scientific illustration. Next. Here are just a few examples of Waugh's collaborations. Next. Then came further new pursuits. She worked as a journalist for major outlets, writing on a broad range of subjects. Her poetry likewise appeared in national publications. She became an arts and culture critic, first in dozens of interviews and profiles for newspapers, then on regional radio, where for 7 years she had her own program, and occasionally on television. Next. She also wrote and illustrated numerous articles for popular magazines and some how-to books. These she published in parallel with her higher brow pieces, just as her father had done. Next. After retiring from the library in 1965 at age 70, Waugh added historian and biographer to her repertoire. Next. Publishing pieces on the history of the Connecticut River Valley, and then at the age of 80 and age 94, respectively, she published 2 exhaustively researched books on the life of fellow Connecticut River Valley and Amherst resident Emily Dickinson, who, as you can see from these 1940s paintings by Waugh of the Dickinson home, had been another lifelong interest. To Waugh's credit, no less than the foremost Dickinson scholar, Yale professor Richard Sewell, insisted on the significance of what Waugh had written. Every student of Dickinson, he said, must take into account Waugh's books. Next. Despite all that, when Waugh died 6 years later, in 1996, just shy of age 100, there was no obituary, and little notice has been taken of her since. This, even though Waugh had received real recognition and sometimes acclaim during her life. Next. One example is the extensive article on her published in the 1940s in AD Magazine, the era's leading graphic design journal. Such a piece was all the more extraordinary for a female designer, and it included this high praise. If taste, high purpose, and skill add up to anything in the graphic arts, and they certainly do, Dorothy Waugh should be considered one of our very best people. Now, we can readily speculate on the reasons why, in the end, Waugh was essentially forgotten. Waugh was a woman. Studies have shown that news outlets are far more likely to select similarly accomplished men for obituaries, which was in fact the case for all the men in Waugh's family who received obituaries. Long-lived, single, and without children, Waugh had no surviving immediate family to attend to her legacy. She did her most widely disseminated and public work, the Parks Campaign, rather early in her career. And her artistic practice emphasized design, illustration, craft, and accessible writing, none of which tend to be critical darlings. But I would add something else. Waugh's polymathy and her pursuit in rapid succession of a multitude of careers likely and ironically contributed to her lack of renown today. For she chose to go as broad in her pursuits as she went deep, and to keep moving, never, for example, returning to poster design. That choice was not bound to bring her the notice associated with a long-time commitment to a single field, but it reflected her many abilities, her boundless curiosity, and a pragmatic need to pay the bills. It reflected who she was. Thank you so much. Next slide. Now I will take any questions you may have. Okay, I see some questions beginning to come in. The first one says, what surprised you most about Dorothy's story or her poster campaign? I think what surprised me most was the fact that no one had told that story before, claiming, even though scholars and critics and so on loved the work that she did for the Park Service, they said, nothing is known about this wonderful work. And that struck me as unlikely, and maybe even reflecting a little bit of scholarly laziness, because the fact is, if you do such a campaign for the national government, there is a long paper trail. And so I decided to start first by exploring that paper trail, which is in the National Archives. And then I added to it investigating papers that her family still held, and papers from the University, the Art Institute of Chicago, and so on. And it just became more and more clear what a remarkable person this was, and how with a certain amount of resolve and dedication, one could unearth it. Next question. From your perspective as a historian of graphic design, what makes Waugh's campaign still relevant today? Are there lessons contemporary designers or cultural institutions could learn from her work? Well, it's interesting. First of all, for those of you who follow politics in this country, the campaign actually is highly relevant in that it shows how differing administrations have managed and viewed the national parks. Presently, we have a situation where the funding for the national parks has been cut by some 30%, and that those cuts are likely to worsen in the coming years. There's that. From a graphic design perspective, I think that it would be a lesson that's, in a sense, not new, but worth repeating, which is the client matters so much. Whether it's a happy relationship with the client or less so can determine so much. And I think that while it's not always possible for the graphic designer to audition their client, so to speak, the more they can work on that relationship, the better. It's not incidental that Waugh had such great backing by a very powerful client within the agency. As I mentioned, Conrad Worth, already then a star within the agency, would go on to head the entire agency. And he really kept, I think you might say, a lot of other bureaucrats at bay. So she was able, once she had established the overall concept of the campaign and a given poster with Worth, she was able to really have great creative freedom. So I guess that's a lesson also for cultural institutions to do what it can to find the right person and then give them some real breathing room. Another question is, do you think her work would look different if it were created today? Very much so. So her work, although the watercolors were, as I mentioned, translated into lithograph, that process involved either stone lithograph, Bavarian limestone, or metal lithographic plates. And that process of doing one color per stone or per plate was, of course, quite labor intensive and expensive. Not surprisingly, it would give way to photographic poster making. And so the posters would likely have been photographs today, I believe probably less interesting, with a photograph then, if you will, having slapped onto it some bit of descriptive text. This question says, do you think Waugh's visual style changed how Americans connected with these landscapes? What a wonderful question. You know, whenever we talk about the impact of a poster, it's always a difficult subject. It's not as if we have subjects showing a one-to-one relationship between what a designer has designed or their intent and how that lands with a viewer. I did mention that as a rough metric on her watch, tourism increased by some 250%. So one can imagine that Waugh's posters were indeed integral in some fashion in that increase. So I do think that she made quite an impact. And I think also the fact that she always maintained just enough illustrational character to the work so that she would not lose her audience with too much abstraction or too much avant-garde was huge. It meant that she had an in then where she had someone understanding well what they were looking at, and yet then she could play. The sky might turn purple. You saw any number of avant-garde elements coming into the work. So I think that it did change America's perception. Remember, at this time, America had a decided preference for highly illustrational or representational depictions. So she was working against that. This says, last question. Do you have a favorite one? You know, there's always that cop out when people are asked because, you know, you begin to think of these works as your children who could therefore state a favorite one. But you will recall that I mentioned a poster that I said looked unlike any that had ever previously been created by an American designer. And it was of that rather robotic looking skier who's about to burst out of, thank you, the racing gates represented by two black bars, which also conveniently house the text. And I think that's a stunning poster. So if push comes to shove, I might well call that my favorite. Thank you so much.